Okay, hi everyone. So on to our last chapter. Talk about ethics and research. Okay? So I'll put an announcement. Some if you're watching this pretty early, then I'll put out an announcement and reminding you what's due this week. Um, but anyways, on to the topic. So ethics is actually quite important. When we do research, we of course have to consider certain ethical things. And what's allowed, what's not allowed, how we recruit people, not just in terms of demographics and sample, but what do we actually give them participating, what's allowed there, what's not. Um, and then also, is our research worth doing? So that's what we're going to talk about today. I'll talk about some key principles of ethical research, look at some examples, and even a bit of history. So, speaking of history, things were not always ethical when it came to research, and well, more specifically, research with human participants. So if you go back a number of years, it was actually pretty terrible what people were allowed to do in terms of research. And I guess on a positive note, that has kind of turned into some strict guidelines that we need to follow. So a lot of this started out with the Nuremberg Code. And this was actually research done a long time ago by Nazi Germany, and they did a bunch of awful stuff, obviously, in their research. So they would do all kinds of crazy things, like see how long someone could last sitting in an ice tub before they got hypothermia, and this kind of in part led to the Nuremberg Code. And you don't have to really know the history of it, but some key features that evolved from this were voluntary participation and the idea of informed consent, as well as research being um, useful to society or needing to be at least potentially useful to society and cannot be obtained in any other way. So, the first one, voluntary participation, is the idea that people, of course, can't be forced into doing research. Right? They should have the option of doing it or not doing it. Even for things like undergraduate, well, not just undergrads, but intro psych classes, students, they have the option of doing research, participating in research, get credit, but they'll also have other options. Um, the other options might be boring, and most of them would rather do the research, but it's important that we'll have the other option so it's not basically a no decision thing. So they have another option if they don't want to do the research, making it voluntary. The other one is, of course, informed consent. So the idea that they're kind of made aware of what's going on in the study, what they'll be asked to do, and um, and stuff like that. Especially if the study does contain something that could be harmful to them or has the potential to be harmful, they have to be made aware of that. Now, that's not to say that you have to tell them um, the full purpose of the study. So you don't have to, if you're doing a false memory experiment, you have to tell them it's a memory experiment, and then they'll be asked questions about something, but you don't have to specifically tell them, oh, um, this is our manipulation, this is exactly what's going to happen, because that would obviously ruin your experiment. Um, the big one is that research should yield results that are useful to society and cannot be obtained in any way. Okay, so we can't just run when you apply for um, when you try to get your ethics approved for your research. There's something known as the IRB, which we might talk about a little bit, but they're just a review board, and they review the ethics of studies before you're allowed to run them. Okay? And these are people who are not part of your research team, so it's not going to be a professor. Well, it will be a professor, but not the one that's running the study or really involved in any way. They're kind of an independent party that's going to assess the research. They're going to decide whether it's useful or not. Okay. Now, how useful research is of course a whole other topic, and sometimes people will do research and it's kind of whether it's a good research project is questionable, but you at least have to be able to give some explanation for how it's useful. You can't just say I want to run this without any reason why it's useful to society. So it has to be potentially useful in some practical way or useful in some theoretical way. And the last point is that it cannot be obtained in any other way. So that's something that also comes up. Whether the study is relatively low risk or it's higher risk, you have to explain that there's no real other way you can do it, right? So if you can just look at some existing data set and your study's not going to tell you anything new, well, then it could be done another way. So that's not going to apply either. On that note, it's also important to, and this kind of stems again from the Nuremberg Code, avoid unnecessary physical or psychological harm. So there are topics in research that could be potentially harmful, right? Asking someone about a sensitive issue that could potentially cause psychological harm. But with that said, we of course need to avoid unnecessary physical or psychological harm. So what we mean by that is just that you're not allowed to do, like if you could test something and make it completely risk-free, you would be expected to do that rather than the more risky option that could be harmful to people. Another one that came out of the Nuremberg Code is that only highly qualified scientists should conduct research. Okay, so when you run a study as either an undergraduate or a graduate student, you have to do so under the supervision of someone with a PhD, a professor. Kind of going back to this issue of the research being useful to society, that in part relates to this point here. So if it's not someone who's, a highly qualified scientist, which is, considered someone with a PhD, you're not allowed to run the research on your own. Again, you can run it under the supervision of someone with a PhD, but not by yourself if you don't have one. So usually if you sign a consent form, if you remember what those are, you'll see something called principal investigator on there. That's the person with the PhD who applied for the ethics clearance. And then the last thing is that the risks should be proportional to the benefits. Right? So if you're doing something that's really not that useful or it's just, not super important, it's really hard to get clearance to run anything that is risky. On the other hand, if you're running something that could really, like say it's a way to treat cancer, well then it can be riskier because the risks should be proportional to the benefits. Okay. The other one we're going to talk about is the Belmont Report. So this is, I think it was in Alabama, some terrible research that was done on actually the spread of syphilis, and it was when it was, but it spawned a bunch of principles when it comes to ethical research that are now carefully implemented today. So one of those is respect for persons, the other one is beneficence, and the last one is justice. So we'll go into what each of those mean. So when it comes to respect for persons, you have to treat the research participants as autonomous individuals capable of making decisions. So you obviously can't treat them like some inanimate object that, you know, isn't, you don't really think of as making um, decisions or anything like that. You have to treat them like people, obviously. Another big thing here, though, is that persons with diminished capacity deserve special protection, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. So, some other things that come from this idea of respect in practice, or respect in general, is again voluntary participation. Okay, so whenever you go to do a study, if you remember back to Psych 100, you probably remember that they give you something like called the consent form. This consent form is done, and you have to sign it. And the research person doing the research, not the principal investigator, but whoever's running the study, has to also sign it. That consent form is going to detail what you're going to do in the study, or not detail it rather, but explain what the study involves, um, what the risks might be, why it's useful, um, and that's about it. But also remind you of a couple other things. So the reason that this is done is again to verify that the person understands the risks of the study, what they're getting from it, um, and all that stuff. So you're not allowed to just have people come in and just say, "Okay, you're ready to do the study. Go ahead." You have to give them this consent form, and they have to read it so that they know what's involved in the study. Another big thing here is that you're not allowed to coerce people. Okay, so you are allowed to offer something for participating. Like usually you'll give them money or class credit or whatever it might be. But with that said, you can't coerce them. So what's the difference between an incentive and a coercion? Well, a coercion is kind of either something that is so motivating that they almost can't say no, or withholding some kind of service. Okay, so with withholding a service, you can't tell them something like, "Oh, like you can't go to any of your classes till you do this research study. Can't eat until you do this study," something like that. That's not allowed. Because you're kind of forcing them basically to do it. Then the other thing is you can't offer excessive motivation to do the study. So again, you are allowed to, of course, pay them to do the study, but you can't, do something that's overly coercive. Um, for example, you can't say you're working with prisoners. You can't tell them, okay, we'll shorten your sentence if you do the study, because that would be considered excessive. Another thing is that they have to have the freedom to withdraw from the study at any time and still get their reward. So when they do the study, they're in the lab running their study. They have to be, and this is all detailed in the consent form as well, they have to be able to withdraw if they choose to. So if the study is making them uncomfortable, it's causing them harm in some way, they have to be able to say, "No, I'm not going to finish this, I'm leaving." Okay, that's another big thing. And the last thing is a debriefing. So a debriefing is going to be explanation of the study and what you were trying to do. So once the study is over, you're going to tell them, here was the purpose of the study. Here's what we hope to learn, so that they kind of know what their data is being used for. Now they will know some of that when they read the informed consent, but you're going to go into more detail at the debriefing. The consent form is more just going to be what will you be expected to do. So if I was running a false memory study and I was looking at, say, how wording a question can influence people's answers, well, usually in the consent form, you'll tell them what they're supposed to do. So this is a study about memory. We're going to have you watch an event and then ask you some questions about it. Then at the debriefing, you're going to tell them, okay, this was specifically about false memory, and looking at how wording a question can influence results. Okay. Back to this issue of special protections for participants who have limited capacity to consent. Well, there's a few people that fall under that category. One is prisoners. Okay, so prisoners are not limited in their ability to consent because of any, um, mental reason, but they of course have a lot of their freedoms taken away. So you have to be extra careful when working with them because they're in a special circumstance. The other one, of course, is going to be children. So when you run studies on children, um, you have to go through a lot of extra hoops, so to speak. Usually, you'll get consent from both them and their parents. And the reason for this is that children are not, well, they're not fully capable um, of giving consent on their own, right? So, they're not mature enough to think about your study and decide whether it's worth doing or not on their own. So that's where you have to also get their parents' consent for them to do the study. The same goes for people with any kind of mental limitations, something like Alzheimer's, Down syndrome, even if it's a fully grown adult, someone who's suffering from one of these things, the same logic applies as with children. They're not, mentally capable enough to make the decision fully on their own. So there's extra steps involved. Okay, and the last thing, or one of the later things, is beneficence. So research participants must be protected, and you must do no harm. Again, you have to maximize the benefits while minimizing harm. So when it comes to protecting research participants, this kind of has a few parts to it. One is usually protecting their data. So you're usually required to keep their data anonymous. So you have their data, but it's not linked to their name. This becomes especially important when you're dealing with very sensitive data. So if you're dealing with something that people might be embarrassed about, or even could get them in trouble, especially, it becomes even more important that you keep their data not connected to their name. Okay? And again, this should all be detailed in the informed consent form. So you obviously, again, you have to make them aware of this stuff. Like if you're going to keep their data anonymous, that should be stated in the consent form. If it's impossible to keep their data anonymous, then you have to detail that in the consent form. And then again, we want to maximize benefits while minimizing harm. So there always could be risks of harm, but we try to keep those as minimal as possible. And building off of this, we want to use the least risky research methods possible. So the less risky it is, the less potential it has to do harm, the better. And like we talked about already, we want to maintain participant confidentiality. So again, if we can keep the data anonymous or not linked to anyone's name, that's definitely what we want to do. There might be situations like an interview where that's not entirely possible, but if we can keep it confidential, then we'll do that. It's also very important that we monitor our research for unforeseen consequences. So you never know, it could be the case that while doing a study, it's causing distress or causing harm that you didn't anticipate or didn't expect. In that situation, it then becomes important to discontinue the study, change it so that whatever was causing harm before is going to stop. Okay. And then again, the last thing is that potential to come out of this Belmont report is the potential risk to participants must be balanced against the potential benefits of the research. So again, if it's some sort of treatment, like say a possible treatment for cancer, well, I mean, that would be probably risky, but the benefits of the research would be proportional to and balanced to the risk to participants. Okay. And then the last thing is that, or getting to the last thing, justice. So the researcher and the participants share equally in the costs and benefits of the research. This just means that the research should be useful to both participants as well as the researcher. So it should be beneficial to um, everyone, not just the researcher. And then lastly, it should be that populations that should or should not be included in the research um, is based on, equal access and vulnerability. So anyone should be allowed to do the study if they want to do it. Okay. And then a couple more things. So justice and practice, we can't just include convenient samples. I mean, a lot of times that does happen, but other people who want to do the study that can do the study should be allowed to do the study, like I just mentioned. And again, have to exercise special care when recruiting people who are vulnerable and have reduced capacity to refuse. So children, so on and so forth. Those with a mental disability, um, prisoners to some degree. Okay, let's take a quick breather.